Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The cemetery was silent, disturbed only by the rustling of dead leaves in the autumn wind. Edward Carmichael, a respected but grieving billionaire, stood before the grave of his only son, Jonathan, who had tragically passed away a few months earlier. Each headstone seemed to whisper memories, but none had left such a profound void as this one. Edward placed a trembling hand on the cold marble, observing the fresh flowers he had chosen himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself be overcome by pain and regret. "If only I could have protected him," he whispered, his voice choked with grief. It was then that a quiet sob caught her attention. A few meters away, a young black woman was crying, crouching beside a little boy who held her hand with disconcerting innocence. She seemed straight out of another world, but the boy had something familiar about him. His eyes. His features. The same radiance Jonathan had had. Edward felt his heart stop for a moment. He moved forward slowly, each step echoing in the heavy silence. The young woman looked up, and their eyes met. Her face was marked by fatigue and pain, but her eyes shone with a surprising strength. The little boy smiled shyly at Edward, a smile that tore at his heart even more. A brutal revelation crossed his mind. This woman, she had her son. How was this possible? Jonathan hadn't had time to start a family, had he? Confusion, anger, despair, and hope swirled within him in an uncontrollable whirlwind. The waitress continued to sob, unaware of the impact her presence had on the approaching man. Edward knew this moment would change his life forever. A long-hidden truth was finally about to come to light. Edward stood there for a few seconds, frozen, unable to speak. The little boy rocked gently on his feet, his fingers clenched around the young woman's hand. He had the same piercing gaze as Jonathan. Every detail awakened in Edward a mixture of pain and wonder. "Excuse me," he finally said, his voice shaky but authoritative, catching the young woman's attention. She looked up, surprised and fearful. His dark eyes met Edward's, and she felt as if she were seeing a ghost. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, quickly wiping away her tears. Edward took a deep breath. What's this child's name?" he asked in a strangled voice. The young woman hesitated, confused by the seriousness in his eyes. "His name is Jonathan. Jonathan Williams." A heavy silence fell. Edward felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Jonathan, like his son. He moved forward again, his hands trembling slightly. "Jonathan. He's my son. Jonathan." The young woman stepped back slightly, stunned. "Your son? But she stammered, unable to continue. She had never imagined meeting her child's biological father. Fear and shame mingled with emotion. Edward watched the little boy, who was looking at his biological father with innocent curiosity. The man's heart sank. "He looks just like you, exactly," he whispered, his eyes misty. "It's impossible. How did this happen?" The young woman took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. I'm sorry. I wanted to protect you, protect us," she said, her voice trembling. "Your son, my son, he's all I have left of him." Edward felt a dull anger rise within him, but also an unexpected surge of tenderness. Everything was confusing, but one thing was clear: he had to understand. "He deserves to know his father," he said firmly. "And I need to know every detail." The wind picked up, making the three figures in the cemetery shiver. In that emotional silence, a fragile but powerful bond had been formed. Edward knew the truth would change everything, for him, for her, and especially for little Jonathan. After a moment of silence, Edward gently invited the young woman to walk with him along the cemetery paths. Little Jonathan trotted alongside, still holding his mother's hand. Each step seemed heavy with the gravity of the situation. "I have to understand," Edward said, his voice deep but shaky. How could my son have a child, without me knowing? The young woman, whose name was Mariah Johnson, looked down, gathering her courage. It was complicated. She took a deep breath. Jonathan and we'd known each other since college. That was, before his tragedy. We were in love, but he was young, ambitious, and he didn't want his family to know. Edward felt a mixture of anger and sadness wash over him. "You're telling me, that boy, is my grandson?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. Mariah nodded. "Yes. Jonathan is my son, your son is his." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I didn't want you to suffer, or for the world to know until he was safe." Edward sat on a bench beside a nearby grave, unable to stand. "And after the accident?" His voice broke. "How did you survive, and why did you never look for me?" Mariah watched little Jonathan play with a blade of grass. "After he died, I was devastated. I didn't know how to contact you. And then, I was scared. Afraid you wouldn't acknowledge him." Edward clenched his fists, trying to contain his emotions. He saw his grandson's innocent face, so similar to Jonathan's. Anger mingled with wonder. "He deserves to know his family," he whispered. "And you were brave to protect him." Mariah nodded, a faint smile appearing despite her tears. "I just wanted him to have a chance, to have a father, even if that father was far away." The wind blew gently, as if to soothe broken hearts. Edward felt that, despite the shock and pain, a new chapter in his life had just begun. The truth was finally out, but it was only just beginning to reveal all its consequences. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Edward Carmichael. He couldn't stop thinking about little Jonathan and Mariah. Every night, he relived the scene in the cemetery, his grandson's innocent face, Mariah's tears, the revelation that had changed his life. He decided to contact Mariah. "We need to talk seriously," he said into the phone, his voice firm but gentle. Mariah agreed, hesitant but aware that it was time. They met in a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Little Jonathan played in a corner with crayons and paper, silently observing his two parents, finally reunited, in a way. Edward sat across from Mariah, looking her straight in the eyes. "I want to build something, for him, for your son. He deserves to know his family, even if everything is complicated." Mariah eyed him suspiciously. "I don't want my son caught up in your business, or your power struggles. He's already lost enough." Edward nodded, aware of his wealth and influence, but determined not to use it against her. "I don't want to scare Jonathan. I just want to be there. And support you, too." The little boy looked up at Edward, a shy smile lighting up his face. Edward felt his heart melt. "Hey, little man," he said softly. Jonathan hesitantly reached out his hand. Edward took it gently, feeling an instant connection form. But reality soon struck. A few days later, Edward's family learned of the grandson's existence. The reactions were strong. His older brother, Richard, and his sister, Vanessa, were incredulous and even hostile. "You can't, we didn't know," Vanessa snapped, her voice thick with reproach. Edward felt the tension rising, but he remained firm. "He is my grandson. And I will do everything to ensure he has a dignified, loving, and secure life." Mariah looked at him, impressed by his determination but worried about the conflicts that would inevitably arise. "Edward, this is a lot for him, for us. Are you sure?" Edward squeezed his grandson's hand, his gaze fixed on Mariah intensely. "I'm sure. For him, I'll face anything." The wind blew through the trees in the park, carrying with it the first shivers of a new life. But Edward knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Accepting his grandson, protecting Mariah, and navigating family tensions would only be the beginning of a journey full of revelations, drama, and difficult choices. A few days after the meeting in the cafe, Edward invited Mariah and little Jonathan to spend a weekend at his vast estate, hoping to create a safe and welcoming environment for them. But as soon as they arrived, whispers began to spread among the Carmichael family's staff and relatives. Edward's brother, Richard, was quick to show his displeasure. "Edward, you can't just bring a stranger and a child into our family like that," he thundered into the large living room, his cold gaze fixed on Mariah. Vanessa, his sister, added in a condescending tone, "And then, who tells us that all this is legitimate? We know nothing about her, nothing about him." Mariah, holding her son's hand tightly, raised her head with dignity. "I never wanted to be here to cause trouble. I just want my son to know his grandfather and be part of his family." Edward stood up, asserting his authority. "She's telling the truth. Jonathan is my grandson. And I will tolerate no questioning of that fact." Little Jonathan, sensing the tension, snuggled closer to his mother. "Daddy," he whispered softly, and Edward felt a pang of guilt and pain at the child's innocence threatened by the adults' bickering. Family tensions weren't confined to the home. Soon, rumors began to circulate among Edward's high society and associates. Some whispered that Mariah was seeking to profit from the billionaire's fortune, while others questioned the child's legitimacy. Edward understood that protecting his grandson and Mariah would take more than money or authority. It would require courage, perseverance, and sometimes, difficult decisions when faced with those who would not accept the truth. That evening, alone in his study, Edward stared at the photo of Jonathan and his grandson. He made a silent decision: nothing and no one could destroy this newfound bond. He would do everything he could to create a bubble of safety and love around Mariah and Jonathan, even if it meant facing his own family and the entire world. The wind blew through the large office windows, a reminder that the storm was only the beginning of a series of trials and revelations that would change their lives forever. A few weeks after their arrival at the Carmichael estate, Edward sensed that tensions were reaching a critical point. The whispers and judgments about Mariah and Jonathan had not subsided. Some influential figures in Edward's business world were beginning to question his stability and judgment. One evening, at a formal dinner with partners and investors, the situation erupted. As Edward introduced Mariah and little Jonathan as his family, one of the investors, arrogant and condescending, said, "I'm guessing this is your new assistant or something?" Silence fell over the room. Mariah felt her hands tremble as Jonathan snuggled closer to her. Edward, his face hardened, stood up and replied with implacable coldness. "No. She's not my assistant. And that little boy isn't something. He's my grandson." The whispers resumed, even louder. Vanessa, who was present at the dinner, shot Mariah a sly look. "Edward, perhaps we should be more careful with these kinds of revelations." But Edward, for the first time in a long time, didn't give in. "Caution? No. This is my family. And no one will question that bond." After dinner, as they were returning to the estate, Mariah turned to Edward, worried. "Edward, you know what this means. Everyone will try to attack us, to discredit us." Edward placed a reassuring hand on Mariah's shoulder. "I know. But I won't let anyone harm that little boy. He's already lost too much." Little Jonathan looked up at his grandfather with innocent curiosity. "Grandpa, are you going to stay with us?" he asked. Edward smiled softly, a new warmth lighting up his face. "Yes. I'll always be here. And I'll protect you, no matter what." That night, Edward realized the social, familial, and financial battles were only just beginning. But for the first time since his son's death, he felt a glimmer of hope. Despite the obstacles, the family had been rebuilt, one bond at a time. Despite Edward's efforts to create a protective cocoon around Mariah and her grandson, reality was beginning to catch up with the family. Curious journalists and skeptical relatives circulated rumors about the child and Mariah, some insinuating that everything had been orchestrated to secure Edward's inheritance. One afternoon, Edward received an anonymous call. The voice, cold and menacing, whispered, "We know everything. You'd better think twice before revealing your grandson to the world." Before Edward could answer, the line went dead. The message left a cold shiver down his spine. He realized that protecting Jonathan would involve more than just confronting his family. Outside enemies, jealous or malicious, might try to take advantage of the situation. He then decided to tighten security around the estate and give Mariah and the little boy a more discreet routine. But the complications didn't just come from outside. One evening, when they were alone at home, Mariah sat next to Edward, her face full of concern. "There's something I haven't told you yet," she whispered. Edward frowned. "What?" Mariah hesitated, her voice trembling. "Before he died, your son and I had made plans. We talked about a future together. And, there's one other detail. Jonathan had debts he'd hidden. He wanted to pay them off before you found out." Edward felt his stomach clench. Jonathan's debts, even small ones, could be used by enemies to attack the family, especially now that the grandson's presence was known. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, a mixture of anger and concern. Mariah looked down. "I wanted to protect you, and protect your grandson. I didn't want you to be overwhelmed by all of this at once." Edward took a deep breath and placed a hand on hers. "All right, we'll face this together. Nothing and no one will touch this family." Little Jonathan, who had been listening silently, hugged his stuffed animal. Edward smiled softly at him. "I'll be there for you, always. And no one can tear us apart." That night, Edward realized that protecting his grandson meant not only defending his family from outside attacks, but also facing the secrets and trials his past had left behind. The road would be long, but he was willing to do anything for his family. A few weeks after the revelations, Edward felt the threat becoming tangible. Reporters began prowling around the estate, asking prying questions and publishing innuendos about Mariah and little Jonathan. But that was nothing compared to what was to come. One night, as the estate lay silent, Edward was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his phone to call security, but before he could act, he saw shadows enter the main hall. Mariah stood outside their bedroom door, little Jonathan in her arms, his eyes wide with fear. Edward charged down the hall, his heart pounding. "Mariah! Jonathan!" he shouted. The intruders seemed to be looking for something, but when they saw Edward, they hesitated, surprised by his presence and determination. Edward, without hesitation, faced the armed men with icy confidence. "Get out of here, now," he yelled. His voice echoed throughout the vast grounds, and his orders to security were immediate. Mariah, trembling, held her son tightly. "Edward, what's going on?" she whispered. Edward reassured her with a look. "Everything will be fine. I'm protecting you." The intruders, realizing they had underestimated Edward's vigilance and power, fled. Security forces quickly pursued and neutralized them. The immediate danger was over, but the threat remained. After this incident, Edward realized that Mariah and Jonathan's safety required more drastic measures. He decided to hire a specialized team, strengthen security, and monitor all communications surrounding the family. Mariah, though shaken, moved closer to Edward. I knew the world could be cruel, but I never imagined this much danger." Edward took little Jonathan into his arms and hugged him tightly. "I will never let anyone hurt you. No matter who they are, no matter what they think, you are my family, and I will defend you to the end." That night, Edward realized the battle to protect his family had begun. The enemies were more numerous than he had imagined, but he was ready to face anything for Mariah and Jonathan. The real fight, the one that would test their strength, courage, and loyalty, was only just beginning. Days after the intrusion into the estate, Edward knew the situation could not remain unclear. The rumors and attacks would continue, and some enemies seemed ready to cross all boundaries to reach Mariah and little Jonathan. He called a meeting with his security team and his most trusted advisors. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "Mariah and Jonathan are my top priority. Anyone who dares threaten them, you know what you have to do. But we also have to be strategic. Meanwhile, Mariah tried to resume some semblance of a normal life with little Jonathan. But the incessant questions from the press and the suspicious looks from the neighbors made all efforts futile. One morning, as they walked in the grounds of the estate, Mariah took Edward's hand. "I don't want Jonathan to grow up in fear. We have to find a way to put an end to this." Edward nodded. "And we will. But to do that, we need to understand who's behind this." Through his network, Edward discovered that some former business partners, jealous of his success and seeking to exploit Jonathan's situation, were fueling rumors and manipulating the media. He then decided to take direct action. He called for a public confrontation, organized to reveal the truth without endangering his family. In a carefully planned press conference, Edward officially announced the existence of his grandson Jonathan and explained the story with transparency: the love between his son and Mariah, the child's birth, and his commitment to protecting and raising Jonathan. The reactions were immediate. Some were shocked, others admired Edward's courage. Enemies, caught off guard, saw their plan fail. Rumors crumbled in the face of the truth being clearly exposed. Mariah, moved to tears, looked at Edward. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Little Jonathan, smiling shyly, squeezed his grandfather's hand. Edward smiled, his heart light for the first time in a long time. "We're together, and no one can tear us apart." However, despite this victory, Edward knew the battle wasn't completely over. Jonathan's family, enemies, and past could still pose challenges. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them, with Mariah and Jonathan by his side. Despite the public revelation, some enemies could not accept the truth. An influential faction, jealous and determined, decided to take action to seize little Jonathan, believing he could be used to weaken Edward and his reputation. One evening, while Mariah and Jonathan were dining at the estate, Edward received an urgent call from his head of security, Mr. Carmichael. "They're approaching. Get ready, it's going to be direct and fast." Without missing a beat, Edward ordered Mariah to take Jonathan to a safe room. "Stay here, I'll take care of everything," he said resolutely. The fear in Mariah's eyes mingled with the trust she now had in him. The intruders, believing the family to be vulnerable, were met with tight security and Edward's perfect strategy. Bright lights, barriers, and armed forces forced them back. But that wasn't all. Edward had anticipated that some might try to enter through side roads. He positioned himself on the main path, ready to protect his family. In the living room, Mariah and Jonathan waited, trembling. The little boy held his mother's hand tightly. "Dad. Grandpa, will everything be okay?" Jonathan asked. Mariah nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, darling. Edward is watching over us." Edward calmly and authoritatively confronted the remaining intruders. His determination was palpable. He would not let anyone harm his grandson. The men were quickly subdued and handed over to the authorities. After this confrontation, a comforting silence enveloped the estate. Mariah approached Edward, her gaze filled with gratitude and admiration. "You risked everything, to protect us." Edward took little Jonathan into his arms. "There's nothing I wouldn't do for you too. You're my family, and I'll protect that bond no matter what." The wind blew gently through the trees, but this time it carried with it a sense of fragile peace. Edward knew the fighting wasn't entirely over, but he had shown that, in the face of adversity, love and loyalty could overcome anything. The following weeks were spent rebuilding peace around the Carmichael family. Threats had been neutralized, the most influential enemies had been discredited, and public rumors had disappeared, replaced by a mixture of admiration and respect for Edward and his family. Mariah, now fully integrated into the life of the estate, watched Jonathan play in the garden with Edward. The little boy laughed carefree, running around his grandfather with boundless energy. For the first time since his birth, he seemed to feel safe and loved. Edward sat down next to Mariah on the stone bench overlooking the garden. "We've been through a lot of storms," he said softly, looking down at his grandson. "But I think now we can finally breathe." Mariah nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, and Jonathan can grow up knowing he's loved and protected." Edward took her hand, gently squeezing her fingers. We've created something stronger than anything we could have imagined, a real family, held together by love and loyalty. Little Jonathan ran towards them, a bright smile on his face. Grandpa! Look what I can do! Edward burst out laughing, a rare and liberating sound for him. He leaned down to hug his grandson. I'm so proud of you, my boy. Mariah, moved, rested her head on Edward's shoulder. We survived all of this together, and now we have a future. The autumn wind blew gently, carrying with it the last traces of pain and fear. Edward, Mariah, and Jonathan stood there, united and invincible. The trials of the past had forged a stronger family, and every glance exchanged between them promised a future filled with love, security, and happiness. Edward's heart was filled with certainty. No matter the obstacles or enemies, he would always protect his family. And for Jonathan, he would always be the grandfather, the guide, and the pillar he could rely on throughout his life. The storm had passed. The family was whole. And for the first time in too long, Edward felt peace truly return to his life.